Welcome to the 247 Sports Recruiting Q&A alongside National Recruiting Analyst Greg Biggins. I'm Brandon Huffman, and today we are going to answer the questions that you may have about recruiting, as well as touch on some of the key topics in recruiting as the season gets going, as the season continues around the country in high school football, as official visit season starts to get re-going. But Greg, let's bring you in here. One of the biggest questions this offseason has been just how solid the commitment to USC that Malachi Nelson, the commitment that he gave to Lincoln Riley last year when he took the job at USC, how solid that was. There was the unofficial visit to Texas A&M in the summer. You got a chance to go watch Malachi play recently, and there's been some buzz that's kind of died down about Texas A&M, but ramped up about USC.
Yeah, no, I think USC is in a good spot right now. And honestly, it always would have been a surprise for me if he went anywhere else, just because of his relationship with Lincoln Riley. Again, as people know, it's not a new thing, but he committed to Oklahoma originally because of Lincoln. Great relationship going back to when he was just an 8th grader freshman. It goes back that far, and he loves the offense, loves the scheme. And I think seeing USC firsthand a couple times this season, and he just kind of seeing the fit and just how explosive that offense is. Stylistically, I think there is some similarities with Caleb Williams. Both these guys are pocket guys that can run. I wouldn't call either dual threat, but they're pocket guys that can run. Not to use hyperbole, but, we saw Caleb a lot back in high school, Huff, and, whether it be Elite 11 or Future 15, again, at the same stage in their development, I think Malachi's probably a little bit of a better pure thrower. And so, yeah, the A&M visit, I think, caught a lot of people off guard. I've known him for a long time. It caught me off guard. I knew there were some schools that were recruiting him heavily. I knew A&M was involved. A few other SEC programs were involved, but I did not know he was going to take that visit the weekend that he did. He did love that visit. A&M was still making a hard push, but just from talking to some people close to the recruitment, I do get the sense that USC has kind of reestablished themselves as not just the leader, but, just the school he's probably going to end up at. I would be shocked if he visited any other schools. Again, there's some schools that are still pushing. Some schools I think might surprise some people because they already have quarterback commitments. But right now, I think USC is in a great spot, and not just for Malachi, but Mekhi Lemon. Those two guys have really been on a tear the last few weeks, and they're playing some really good football. So that's good news for the Trojans.
We obviously know what Lincoln Riley and his offense and what his quarterbacks can do, but how much do you think it's solidified given the results of what Caleb Williams has done in the first 3 games, but also the offensive struggles with Texas A&M through those first 3 games? It's kind of a worst-case scenario for Texas A&M. You probably thought that for Texas A&M to have a chance, they needed their offense to really light it up and maybe USC's offense to not look so explosive, but it's been the complete opposite. How much do you think those 2 scenarios have kind of solidified things for him in USC?
Yeah, no, I do think that played a role. And it's funny. I think if, game 1, it's A&M beating Miami, I think there might be, maybe a little bit of buzz for A&M right now. It just so happened they lost to an App State team that honestly, Appalachian State, that's a good program, right? I think people think they just lost to, Elbow State or something. Like App State they're solid every single year. And so that's not a horrible loss. And obviously beating Miami. And we kind of predicted this right on our little group chat. We said A&M always has that one kind of weird, funky, ugly loss, and they'll go back and rebound and go beat Bama, right? So we kind of thought that they'd rebound. But, I do think that ugly loss to start off, right at the gate did kind of diminish in their eyes maybe a little bit where the Aggies were coming from. And then, like you said, man, just watching USC, the offense, and Malachi is still a ringleader when it comes to, being a recruiter. He's on the phone, he's working it. And he's doing what a quarterback should be doing. He's the headliner of that class, and he's trying his best to bring as much talent as he can around them. And, I think he believes in USC, and he always has. Some people talk about, NIL situation, A&M is going to be able to do this, and USC can't. Malachi is going to be fine, with NIL. He's going to be good to go. I think there was some talk about, can USC compete, for other position players. Malachi wants some talent around him, specifically, some offensive line talent, some D tackle talent. How can USC compete with some of these SEC programs from an NIL standpoint to make it a level playing field? And so he's not just, after throwing to some great skill players, without a great supporting cast in the trenches. But I think right now that has kind of subsided as well. And like I said before, I think USC is in a really good spot right now for Malachi.
You're joining the 247 Sports Recruiting Q&A with Greg Biggins. I'm Brandon Huffman. Before we get to our first question, though, staying on the Texas A&M subject, they did host another visitor who was committed to the other school in Los Angeles, Roger Robinson, the 4-star running back out of Lincoln High School in San Diego. He took an official visit to Texas A&M this weekend. Miami has also been recruiting him. So you got to see two of the schools that have been making a push since he committed to the Bruins in action this weekend. But Greg, I know you caught up with Roderick. What's the feeling on that commitment to UCLA with the visit to Texas A&M and then another big SEC visit coming later this fall?
Yeah, no. So I probably have Aggie fans kind of maybe cussing me out right now for my Malachi bad news. But I think with Rod, I think it's a lot more positive. He loved the trip. And, he's got a little bit of a connection with the Aggies. OC, Jason Carter over at Lincoln, who does a phenomenal job as kind of like just the recruiting liaison also at Lincoln. He's a former Aggie. And he's not going to push his kids anywhere. But I do think that A&M made a huge impression. And say what you want about Texas A&M, but that game day atmosphere is unlike many other places. And he loved it. College Station, he said he kind of loved it, the small town vibe. He's originally, I know he lived in San Diego, but Roderick's originally from the South, specifically in South Carolina. And he's like, kind of reminded him back home, or he said, everyone kind of knows your name. He didn't use the word cheers. That's, when I keep hearing that term, reminds me of my all-time favorite sitcom back in the day, but everyone kind of knows who you are. And he liked that aspect. He likes the offense. So much talent around him at A&M potentially. He likes the running back room. And then the coaches, Tommy Robinson, is doing a great job recruiting him, saying, hey, we don't just want you, we need you. Like, you're not just, one of many pieces. We don't have a big power back like you. And you look at Rod, he's having an unbelievable season. 8 touchdowns 2 weeks ago. And, he's 6 feet and he's 230. I think he's quicker and more explosive than given credit for. We've seen him at a number of camps, and I think he catches the ball exceptionally well in the backfield. So UCLA, he told me, still committed. Just my gut feel, though, I think it's going to be tough for UCLA to hang on to him. And so A&M made a huge impression, but I also say watch out for Georgia. He's going to visit there next month for the Auburn game, and you can anticipate that atmosphere being pretty wild as well. The SEC schools, all right, they kind of know how to do it. Official visits is going to be huge for them. And, talk about running the football. Right now, Georgia is doing it as well as anyone. They do run with big backs. He fits that scheme, that offense well, too. So UCLA still in it, obviously. He's a commit, but watch out for the Aggies and watch out for Georgia, obviously.
All right, we have our first question coming up after we talked about Malachi Nelson, Roderick Robinson. Let's go up to Northern California, to the Bay Area, to the top player in Northern California. Got a question from a guy named Cooper Patagna. There we go.
Who's that?
Longtime listener, first-time caller. Thanks for joining us, Coop. Who does Jurion Dickery remind you of that's come out recently on the West Coast? I would say a kind of a body that he reminds me of a little bit is G. Scott Jr., who played 3 years ago up in the state of Washington at Eastside Catholic. He is now at Ohio State. Obviously, Dickey's got a lot more speed than G. Scott, but from a physical standpoint, there's a lot of similarities between the two. Now, G. Scott has transitioned away from playing wide receiver at Ohio State. He's now playing tight end. I don't know that Dickey will ever make that move from receiver to tight end, but from a physical standpoint, there's a lot of similarities, but a little bit more explosive. Greg, you got to see Jurion a lot this summer. You and I have seen him a ton over the last 3 years at 7-on-7 tournaments, at the opening. You saw him at the OT7 in Las Vegas. We both saw him at the at the ESPN Under Armour camp back in May. And the competitiveness is something that's always stood out to me. And that's something that we maybe haven't seen as much in the last couple of years. Maybe it was the pandemic related. But in terms of his willingness to go and get work when he's already an All-American, when he's already committed, that's something that I really love to see. But who was a player that you would say he reminds you of similarly?
So me and Chris Singletary at OT7, we're actually spent a decent amount trying to figure out who does he remind us of. He's got a very unique skill set. And for me, he's the most complete receiver in this class. There's not really one thing that he doesn't do well. And you can kind of nitpick with every other receiver. Maybe he's fast, but not big. Maybe this guy's got great hands, but not super explosive. This guy doesn't always compete hard. Not going to name names on any of those guys, but Jurion is a legit 6'3". I don't think people realize how big he is until you see him in person. He's a legit 6'3" and like 210. Yeah. And he's strong and he's physical and he's a 4-5 guy every single time you see him tested. And he plays 4-5. So he's that big, strong possession receiver body with deep speed who runs out to the catch and competes like crazy. So I'm going to go real old school. Chris actually had this one, and I love this receiver back in the day, but it kind of reminds us a little bit of Sterling Sharp. Not to be confused with Shannon Sharp, you see on TV all the time, but Sterling had the neck injury with the Packers, but he was an exceptional receiver, like top 10 receiver of all time. If you actually watch Sterling Sharp, big, strong, physical. Juron might have a couple inches on him, but just the similar playing style, strong hands, high level compete, and just an explosive game breaker. Stretch the field after the catch. It gives you that ability too. So Jurion Dickey, for me, man, he is the most complete guy in this year's class. I love the way he plays and competes.
You go old school. I remember being on an elevator with Sterling Sharp at the old Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas, which is now Planet Hollywood. But I figure we're going, you referenced Cheers earlier. Now referenced Sterling Sharp. Next thing you're going to tell me is that MTV used to play music videos back in the day. Speaking of teams that back in the day used to get every offensive lineman that they really targeted, USC. Now, we always think back in, you and I talk about the 2008 class a lot, where the top two linemen in the country that year were both USC signings, Tyrone Smith, Matt Khalil, who they both went on to be the #1 offensive lineman picked in consecutive drafts in 2011 and 2012. Both ended up being left tackles. In the NFL, Tyrone Smith still playing for the Dallas Cowboys. But there's been some consternation, some concern with USC. And Danny Hernandez has a question. What's our thoughts on USC potentially missing on all of its big-time lineman targets? Now, you got to go back to the mid-2000s, the late 2000s, when Pete Carroll was there, where it seemed like USC was getting every elite offensive lineman, where it seemed like if they tried to recruit a Sam Baker, a Kyle Williams, they got him. Now there's been some misses, and I think it was further accentuated back in the spring when Josh Connerly, who looked like he was heading to USC, ended up picking Oregon, but it's not all bad. Now, right now, USC is having more success with interior offensive linemen, and maybe not some of the highest rated players, but they flipped Amos Talalele from Cal. They were able to make a late push to get Micah Banuelos, who looked like he might have been headed to Oregon, and then they were able to get Alani Noah from Grant High School in Sacramento. But there's still some other offensive tackles. Is this just more of a matter of Josh Henson trying to get a lay of the land out west? Is it speaking to something deeper, or are USC fans not appreciating the ability of a Noah, a Banuelos, a Amos Talalele? Greg, I know you're a big Micah Banuelos fan yourself. Is this maybe a little bit of an overreaction since maybe some of those elite guys haven't committed to them?
I would say this isn't, a 2023 thing. It's probably the last 3 or 4 year thing, right? And I've been kind of beating the drum saying, where are the linemen out west? That's offensive linemen and then D tackles. And it's been, for me, as a Southern California guy, I've been saying, look, I don't know where they are, but we just don't have elite level linemen out here anymore. And it's been 5 years and running now. And you watch Pac-12 football, and it's very much a finesse conference. And people will say, what's the deal? How come when these schools go play, an Ohio State, a Notre Dame, a big physical school in the SEC, why do they get run over? And I say, I think California football as a whole is a little bit down, and just lineman wise, we just don't have them. So if you're, Josh Henson, you have to recruit nationally. And I think that's what Mario Cristobal, he got when he was at Oregon. He said, maybe 10 years ago, you could just recruit California and you're going to be set. Even Urban Meyer said that when we talked about the USC job. You don't have to leave campus to recruit and be a national title contender. I said, no, you definitely have to leave Southern California. We don't have national caliber O-linemen or D tackles out here right now. So I like Micah. I like Amos. I like all those guys you just mentioned. I think 24 class looks a little bit stronger, right? Brandon Baker and DeAndre Carter are two of the top players in the class, but they just we don't seem to have them. Last year we had Ernest Green, and he was a tremendous offensive lineman. He, a little bit injured right now at Georgia. He probably would have been in the 2 deep, but like in the South, there's probably 15 Ernest Greens. And so I think if you USC and those fans saying, hey, where are the linemen? You have to recruit national. I think the portal will definitely help all schools out west. Specifically, I think USC has already shown they can recruit the portal very effectively. But if you want to recruit a national championship level offensive line and D tackles, you're going to have to leave home and recruit. And I think Coach Henson and Lincoln Riley, they kind of know what they're doing. They are going to have a national type of reach, not just recruiting California, but going all over the country. And I think that's the plan. And I think that so far, I think it's going to be pretty effective.
Speaking of national reach, Chris Cartman, the publisher of Sun Devil Source, tweeted out earlier today that buzz about Deion Sanders and Arizona State. Now, over the weekend, Herm Edwards, we don't know if he was end zoned. We know he wasn't tarmac. He got fired out. Mutually agreed to relieve his duties. But there has been some buzz about some other coaches nationally. But when Chris tweeted about Deion Sanders, and Deion's name's been brought up, and it's going to be brought up anytime a big-time job opens up. Deion Sanders, Arizona State. Arizona State's been considered a sleeping giant for 100 years. Deion Sanders has recruited nationally, getting Travis Hunter a year ago, along with so many other players. Greg, let's hypothetically speak for a second. What would a Deion Sanders to Arizona State impact have on recruiting, not just regionally, in a state where Arizona State has struggled to recruit in its own backyard, where they've had to kind of go nationally? What would Deion Sanders bring to Tempe if he were to get that call?
I don't have the correct words. I think it'd be huge. That's being conservative. I don't think people understand, maybe outside the West, Huff, Arizona State, you mentioned the sleeping giant. It absolutely is. I just this week, I was talking to some coaches from other programs who's saying, dude, ASU is a great job, right? There's always some decent talent in state. But people, man, they love Tempe. I've been to Tempe before, and let's just say there's a lot there to get you excited about. Not just talking football wise, but it's just a fun place. I'm just going to keep it G-rated, and we'll just go football-wise, man. There's a lot to sell. I think Deion Sanders at ASU would absolutely kill it from a recruiting standpoint. I think kids already kind of have an idea that, ASU is a place that you can win at. You can win pretty big at. It's a national brand, surprisingly, and not just in football. I mean, people know, from a basketball standpoint, baseball standpoint even, right? They've had some dudes at ASU in all sports. I think Deion Sanders, again, you see what he's doing at Jackson State. Now, for me, if I'm any coach, the first question I want to ask is, okay, are there some sanctions coming down? Am I going to have some reduced scholarships? I do want to know about all that kind of stuff. But if it's just football, recruiting, and coaching, I think you can win big at ASU. And I think Deion would be an absolute grand slam for the Sun Devils.
I think what's the most fascinating part of that is that they've already gone the Under Armour coach route once before with Herm Edwards, the television personality. But there's Herm Edwards on television. There's Herm Edwards in the national lexicon, and then there's Deion Sanders. I think, like you said, words couldn't even put it into description what kind of buzz that would bring. That would be the one that would maybe break Twitter. Last week when Queen Elizabeth died, Twitter broke for a little bit. I think Deion to Arizona State, really Deion to any FBS program might break Twitter, but that would be that would be one that would be fun to watch. I remember the days, back in the days when you and I were competing against each other, we would talk about to recruits that took visits when Dennis Erickson was the head coach at Arizona State. And about 8 minutes into the call, that's how old school was. We would get on the phone and call these guys. It would take about 8-9 minutes till we actually heard about the football side of the trip. Is that something that ASU is missing? We'll see. But with Herm Edwards no longer the head coach at Arizona State, is Sean Aguano going to be able to get the interim label taken off? Is there going to be somebody else? Mike Norvell's name's come up, former Arizona State offensive coordinator, Kenny Dillingham, an Arizona State grad. But Deion Sanders is one that would definitely set the world on fire. Speaking of what's going to set the world on fire, tonight, Tuesday night, Blake Nicholson, the 4-star All-American linebacker out of Manteca, California, is set to make his announcement here on the 247 Sports YouTube channel. Myself, Greg Biggins, will be hosting that announcement. But he's named a final 3 of Florida State, Oregon, and UCLA. Really, it's been a Florida State-Oregon battle. He took official visits to both Florida State and Oregon in June, took an unofficial visit to Florida State for about 4 days at the end of July, but then was back in Eugene this past weekend for an unofficial visit, was there for the Oregon game against BYU. Greg, we're getting down to nitty-gritty time. You and I have not changed our crystal ball from Florida State, but Oregon, we've seen this movie before. We mentioned it earlier with Josh Connerly, a recruitment that looked like it was heading one way at the last minute, takes a left turn. What's kind of the latest you're hearing on Blake Nicholson's decision?
I mean, obviously, we don't want to give away the answers to the test and excuse the dog barking in the background. I think the dog's excited about Blake Nicholson's announcement as well. But no, obviously, we don't want to give up too much. You have had a great idea of what Blake's going to be doing this whole entire time. And, that last-minute visit to Oregon kind of was a little bit interesting for me. But again, I think, as we talked about off air, I think you recruit not just knowing, hey, if this guy commits to us, great, but you also recruit and don't burn bridges because, man, the way the portal is so active, man, you don't know if the guy is going to be coming back on the market in a year or 2 years. So I think right now our crystal balls are still on the Knolls, and I think they're probably still in a good place. I think that would be a great get for them. He's a talented kid with so much positional versatility. And I kind of got a little bit of an Asa Turner vibe from him, Huff. That linebacker with kind of a safety frame, but he's an athlete that can run around and make plays, a 2,000-yard running back. And so a really active kid. We, again, mentioned Jurion, where didn't we see Blake? Blake was all over the place, right? National preps events, Under Armour, UC. So right now, I do think the Noles are still in a good spot, but Oregon probably gave him a little something to think about, whether it be for that here and now or maybe for 2 or 3 years from now. But, we'll find out tonight. That's all you hosting that one. So, again, don't want to give away anything, but I'll be tuned in, and I'm kind of curious myself to see what Mr. Blake Nicholson is going to do.
Yeah, a lot of positional versatility. I like the Asa Turner reference. Blair and Giller were talking about that. We were previewing his decision. That he's a guy who's probably best suited for linebacker, but he's got the athleticism. You could put him as a safety. You could, make him a 3-down backer. Maybe give him some goal line packages on offense too. He was the second leading touchdown scorer in the state of California. As a junior, already rushed for a number of yards this season, a number of touchdowns, but his future is at linebacker. Speaking of linebackers, there's another prospect that there's a question. He's not a linebacker. He's a defensive player, but also some Southern schools that are really involved there. There's a question, when do you think Javion Tobiano will commit? Now, there had been a kind of a long time feel that, he was going to stay in the state of Texas and head to the University of Texas. Obviously, what Steve Sarkisian has done in year 2, the close loss to Alabama, I don't want to, reference, but I will. You remember in 2005 when Notre Dame nearly beat USC and Notre Dame ended up giving Charlie Weiss like a 100-year extension. I don't think this is the loss like that. This was a loss that's showing that in year 2, Texas is making some strides. So a guy like Tobiano to get an in-state recruit would be big. But then Steve Wilfong put in a crystal ball a week ago for LSU. LSU has been making a push themselves. Not entirely certain when the commitment's going to be made, but right now LSU is making a big push there. He's been to Baton Rouge a number of times, obviously plenty comfortable with LSU, plenty comfortable with Texas. Decision could be forthcoming. It seemed like when we were out at Future 50 down in Bradenton back in July, there was talk even then that a decision could be imminent. But Tobiano said that he may wait all the way until through the fall, after he's done checking out all the schools that he wants to. So not as much clarity there with Tobiano like there is with Blake Nicholson, who we know is announcing tonight, but one that certainly LSU and Texas fans and other schools that are still involved will be watching. Before we get to our next question, though, we want to talk about a player who you've gotten to see quite a bit this fall that I got to see in the spring. One of the newest 4-stars on 247 Sports is Downey, California quarterback Aidan Childs. Now, if you don't know Aidan Childs, if you don't know who he is, that's understandable. But you want to talk about a player who's been overshadowed. He grew up in Los Alamitos. Well, Malachi Nelson, Los Alamitos High School. He plays at Downey High School right across town at Warren High School, Nico Iamaleava. So as good of a quarterback as Childs is, he's not gotten the attention of a Malachi Nelson and a Nico Iamaleava, and understandably so. But this season, he's really catapulted his game. We had a great conversation last week in our recruiting call talking about the improvement that he's made. His coach, Jack Williams, has been quietly saying, he's been making that jump, and you've gotten a chance to see that jump. A new 4-star. When he committed to Oregon State back in the spring, it was kind of a surprise because there were other schools that had gotten involved. He took that visit to Oregon State, quickly committed to the Beavers, and now Oregon State might be getting a heck of a steal in Aidan Childs.
Yeah, no, I mean, Oregon, Washington had offered him and were recruiting pretty heavily. Now, I think it's a great story. You mentioned started off at Los Al, Malachi Nelson's there, moves over to Downey High School, had this thing called COVID out here, so no fall football season. So he played like just a few games in the spring season. Last year, off to a really good start, and then he got injured and only played about 4 games last year. So we saw him a ton, 7-on-7, saw him at multiple camps, and obviously camps and 7-on-7, that's not real football. We get that, but just when you're looking at a body and you're looking at physical tools, that's what those events are good for. And he's a long, athletic, 6'4", has like a basketball body, a little small forward. He's loose and flexible and athletic. I like the way the ball comes out. Huge personality. I'm just a fun kid. Only 16 years old. So, I mean, compared to, some quarterbacks were 16 when they were in 7th grade, it seems like, right? So Aidan, he's got a lot of more physical maturing to go. But I think the comp for him, and it might be a little bit lazy, but Justin Martin at UCLA, another kind of a late bloomer, right? A little bit, long development guy who played behind some guys. I think Childs is probably further along than Justin was at the same stage. And, Aidan, I'm looking forward to the game in a couple of weeks. They're going to play Nico Maliava when Downey plays well, which is an awesome rivalry. But no, still for Oregon State. And I think, he's a 4-star now outside the 247. I do think he's an eventual top 247 guy. I love what he brings to a program. And I think Jonathan Smith, Huff, we've had this conversation off the air right now. And Oregon State, they're building something pretty nice. You got to assume Jonathan Smith's name is going to be up for a lot of potential coaching openings. ASU was just one, but you have to assume might be a few others out west. But Jonathan Smith kind of has a good thing going at Oregon State. And Aidan Childs, man, that's a guy he's the kind of guy that you want to stick around for, just to develop and coach that guy for a few years.
In my opinion, he's probably the most talented quarterback as a high schooler that Oregon State has gotten a commitment from since Sean Mannion. I've already went over that one ad nauseum over the last 13 years. That one of my biggest regrets was not making Sean Mannion a 4-star before he left Oregon State. He left as the Pac-12's all-time leading passer. But Aidan Childs, kind of a similar rise. When you think about Sean Mannion, he was overshadowed at times by quarterbacks at Monte Vista, at De La Salle up in the Bay Area, and ended up having a tremendous career at Oregon State. Jonathan Smith's got Southland ties. Interestingly enough, Aidan Childs, his coach, played at Azusa Pacific University, won a national championship there. Jonathan Smith nearly ended up at Azusa Pacific University, where his mom was a professor in nearby Glendora. There's a lot of connections between those two guys, but Jonathan Smith goes to Oregon State. The rest is history. Now his name's catching buzz with a lot of these opening jobs. I don't see him leaving Corvallis. And when you're building what he's built, and you look in year 5 of his time at Oregon State, early on, there was a lot of JUCO transfers, a lot of transfer portal players. Their starting quarterback, Chance Nolan, is a JUCO. They originally had Tristan Jebbia at quarterback before he got injured against Oregon 2 years ago. He was from the transfer portal. But in the 2022 class, Oregon State signed just one transfer from the JUCO ranks, and it was a high school heavy class. That's when you're building your foundation right. You no longer look for immediate quick fixes. You can get those high school players. Aidan Childs, again, could be a heck of a steal for Jonathan Smith and the Beavers. We've talked a lot about Pac-12 recruiting, a lot of West Coast recruiting. A couple of West Coast teams had some big non-conference wins over the weekend. Washington beating Michigan State at Husky Stadium. Oregon beating BYU at Autzen Stadium. We got a question, though, about some of the moves from the Pac-12 schools that are making a move to the Big Ten. So we'll put that question up. Between USC, UCLA, and maybe Oregon, who cashes in the most with the move to the Big Ten on and off the field? I mean, to me, the team that probably gets the most out of this is USC. They make the move from the Pac-12 to the Big Ten. Obviously, they've been a national brand. We talked about the Matt Khalil, Tyrone Smith. Both guys are from Southern California, but that was during an era where USC was going back east to New Jersey to get a Brian Cushing, going down to Florida to get Keith Rivers and Mike Williams, going to Northern California to get a Ray Maluga, going to the Midwest to get players. USC's always been able to recruit nationally. Now, we know Oregon has obviously ramped up their national recruiting in recent years, given their success on the field. Part of it's because they don't have a fertile recruiting base in their backyard like USC and like UCLA does. But from those three schools, to me, USC stands to benefit the most. They make the move to a new conference. They're going to be on even more households nationally. Oregon is in a position right now where we don't know what direction the Pac-12 is going to go. We don't know if Oregon's going to stay in the Pac-12, if they go to the Big 12, if they end up in another conference. But right now, my opinion is that USC stands to benefit it from the most on and off the field. Obviously, UCLA's financial situation improves greatly off the field, but if nobody's going to games at the Rose Bowl, it's not really going to resonate like USC with Lincoln Riley, with a team that's won 3 games. Agree or disagree?
You're kind of reading my mind. I was going to bring up UCLA's financial, who has the most to gain. There was talk that without this move, UCLA might have to actually shut down some non-revenue sports, some of those Olympic sports. People are probably joking saying, was football still a revenue sport for UCLA? That was mean, Huff. I know what you're thinking over there. But no, I think from a recruiting standpoint, USC, if they have the right head coach and they're rolling like they are right now with Lincoln, I think they're going to be able to recruit nationally no matter what conference they're in, right? If it's the Pac-12, 10, whatever the Pac-12 is going to become. if they played as an independent, the Big Ten. I think USC's brand is so strong, and I think Lincoln is such a great hands-on head coach recruiter, and he's got a staff that seems to be very active as far as from a recruiting standpoint. I don't know if they're going to get necessarily a huge bump, only because I think they're going to get a bump regardless of what conference, if that makes any sense. Oregon also, they recruit really, really well. They recruit nationally, whether it be Mario, now it's Coach Lanning. They really get after it as well. UCLA, we've talked about them a lot from a recruiting standpoint, just a different mindset when it comes to recruiting, not so much high school kids. Maybe a little more portal, maybe not those 4 or 5-star guys, maybe go after the lower rated guys, and hopefully we can, out evaluate and then out develop. We'll see if that's going to work. But, I think all three would benefit a little bit from it. USC, I agree with what you said, although I do kind of want to say, hey, USC, when they're rolling, they can recruit no matter what. And then I just think the financial reasons for UCLA are obvious. And that's why it's probably a good move for them to do it.
A lot of great questions today on the recruiting Q&A. Great question about the USC, UCLA moves to the Big Ten, maybe Oregon. But let's talk some Pac-12 recruiting real quick. Obviously, we mentioned earlier the big wins by Washington over Michigan State this weekend. Oregon over BYU. Both were in front of home crowds. Washington had a giant weekend in terms of recruits that came in for unofficial visits. They had a couple of key official visitors. Got a couple of commitments in the 2024 class. Landon Bell out of Las Vegas, Nevada, or out of Henderson in nearby Las Vegas. Liberty High School, same school that Troy Fontenot, who's starting left tackle for the Huskies, played at. Jeremy Bernard, who was a longtime commit to the Huskies, who ended up transferring to Michigan State, played in that game. Landon Bell comes from that same school. Jackson Jones out of Yuma Catholic, also committed to the Huskies. The Oregon Ducks were able to have a number of recruits on campus. We mentioned Blake Nicholson was there earlier. Some of their in-state targets, like AJ Pugliano, who's the #1 player in the state in 2024, was there. Tatum Tuioti, another recent upgrade to a 4-star from Sheldon High School in Eugene, also in attendance. And there's another interesting recruiting battle. There's been a lot of interesting recruiting battles going on between Washington and Oregon. One of the official visitors at Washington this week was David Peavy out of Lincoln High School in San Diego. Oregon looked like they were in the pole position to get him. USC was making a push, but he took an official visit to Washington. Roderick Robinson wasn't the only Lincoln Hornet on the road this week. David Peavy was, Greg, and I know you got a chance to catch up with him.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an interesting recruitment. David was basically kind of I don't want to use the word silent, but he was a heavy Oregon lean for about a month. In fact, we did his edit for him already. We thought he was going to Oregon. And then I would say, hey, this week at the committee goes, maybe next week. And there was maybe next week and maybe next week. And, we've seen that before where, if there's a school that a player is a heavy lean for, but can't quite pull the trigger, you kind of almost wonder, okay, is there something holding this kid back? He was going to commit this Wednesday, which is his birthday, the 21st. I think it's Wednesday, or maybe it's tomorrow, whatever the 21st is. My brain fog's kicking in. But he's going to delay it regardless. He's going to delay the commitment now because of that trip to UW. He loved that visit. Loved the coaching staff. William Inge is doing an awesome job recruiting linebackers. And Courtney Morgan, a guy who we both covered back when he was in high school, kind of shows how old we are. And I think Washington, man, they had a perfect storm where they had a great crowd. They played a great opponent. They beat them pretty decisively, and defensively, they looked great doing it. So I think if you're David Peavy, now all of a sudden you're saying, hey, Washington, I kind of like what they're showing. And it wasn't just with Peavy. It was a lot of recruits that were there. I think people like the general direction that Washington's going in. They had a huge summer. I don't remember the exact weekend. I don't have your memory recall like I used to, Huff. But, they had that weekend. They had like 8 commits, and I think it was in June. Mm-hmm. But ever since then, I've noticed a real nice buzz for the Huskies. And I think this past weekend, you go and you can always sell direction and hope. But if you're a recruit, you want to see it with your eyes, right? And so I think you go and beat up a Michigan State team that everyone universally respects. Now you could say, okay, we've been selling future, but now you can actually see it. Look what we just did. And this is our first year in the program. Coach DeBoer, man, he's a very good head coach. And I think if you're a Washington fan, you got to be excited. And if you're a recruit, I think those kids are very excited about the Huskies and the direction they're going in right now.
Another key recruitment to watch is that of Kayla Presley. Right now, he's the #1 player in the state of Washington, out of Rainier Beach High School in Seattle, committed to Oregon back in early July, but he was in attendance at Husky Stadium on Saturday night, watching Washington against Michigan State. There was a picture of him on Twitter of him wearing a purple sweatshirt. He even tweeted that, he loves to see his city win. We caught up with him, and he said that he's still 100% committed to Oregon, but he wanted to see if Washington and Juice Brown, the defensive backs coach for the Huskies, could bring UW back to DBU. made a great impression on them in that game with their defensive performance against Michigan State. But he said he's still solid to the Ducks. Greg, you and I just love writing stories that involve Oregon and Washington. And we really love tweeting about it too, because nobody ever comments or likes or ever dialogues on those at all. But two guys that were in Seattle this last weekend, two guys that Oregon either has a commitment from or that they really want. You know the world is back on the right axis when Oregon and Washington fans are fighting about recruiting and everything else this heavily in September. And we get to be the observers of that neutrally as we watch that. But it's been a good weekend for West Coast football, for Pac-12 football. Could have even had a bigger weekend had the Hail Mary that Cal threw up right in front of touchdown Jesus been maybe caught. But two significant wins. Now we head fully into Pac-12 play out west, but there's still a lot of West Coast guys that are planning to take some visits nationally. And Georgia, you mentioned them earlier, with Roger Robinson coming to town in early October. Can we still see the exodus of West Coast guys heading elsewhere to the South, heading to the Big Ten, wherever it may be? Will that continue? Or is the Pac-12, which has been on life support for the last couple months, finally starting to show some puncher's chance? We'll be back in a few weeks to talk more about that. But we want to thank you for joining us here on the 247 Sports Recruiting Q&A. Make sure to join us tonight, 9:30 Eastern Time, 6:30 Pacific Time, here on the 247 Sports YouTube channel. Greg Biggins will be joining me for the announcement of Blake Nicholson, the 4-star linebacker from Manteca, California, who will be announcing between Florida State, Oregon, and UCLA here on the 247 Sports YouTube channel. We hope to see you back tonight.